Hi, everybody. Jim Hessler from the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, and I'm back with another one of my history interruptions. This is where I periodically come in and I interrupt our normal podcast programming, usually to interview another historian, author, or a friend. And in this case, I have all of the above. I'm talking to Bob O'Neill, who is an old friend of mine and an esteemed cavalry historian. And Bob is the author of the new book. Let me line it up here on camera. Small but Important Riots, the Cavalry Battles at Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. So Bob and I are going to talk a little bit about these cavalry actions that lead up to the Gettysburg Campaign and why we think they're interesting and important. So first of all, Bob, welcome. Thanks for your time, and thanks for agreeing to, waste an hour or so of your time with me tonight.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for extending the invitation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. You are a truly esteemed cavalry historian. Everybody I know respects the heck out of you. For the listeners' sakes, Bob and I have known each other socially for a number of years. We kind of came together in our mutual interest for topics related to George Armstrong Custer and some of the stuff that happens out west. But for everybody's benefit here, Bob, you want to, yeah, there you go. Right. For everybody's benefit, you want to tell folks a little bit about yourself and how you got so interested in the cavalry and then this topic specifically?
Sure. I'm a retired police officer and grew up in Michigan, Detroit. Moved to Virginia and looked for a job in Virginia because I had an interest in the Civil War. Went to a family vacation to Gettysburg when I was very young. I don't know exactly when. I guesstimated the date or the age a number of times. 7, 8 years old, something like that. Had a licensed battlefield guide from back in the day in the car. You should be honored. And
it wasn't me, of course, but yeah, still honored.
I remember only two things, one of which I don't think I've ever seen again. But the most important one was the John Buford statue. Now, I don't remember anything in between. I don't remember the conversation. The John Buford statue has always stuck with me. The only other thing I remember is there's a cannon barrel out there that was hit by a cannon shell and has a big divot in it. And I had a picture of it for years, and that's it. But that's part of being a kid. And and then to what you just mentioned a few minutes ago, very early on, about the same time, my parents gave me a children's story, if you will, of the Little Bighorn and George Custer. And I became a George Custer fan from what is actually now a terrible book.
Yeah.
But as a kid, it did what it was supposed to do, and it fueled my interest. And
yeah.
So the two of them, you look at what a kid would be interested in, the sharp uniforms, the natty jackets with the trim and all those kind of things kind of played a role. And then when it came time, getting out of college, look for a place to work. I came to Virginia, so I was closer to the opportunity. And ultimately, after settling into the job, getting married, all that kind of stuff out of the way, I had time to begin actually looking into the Civil War, kind of doing what I wanted to do. Met a friend up in Loudoun County who had helped Wilbur Nye when he studied these battles, Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, for his book in the 60s, Here Come the Rebels. And so that gentleman, John Devine, the very first time I met him, he and I went out and he gave me the first tour of these battles, the fields, the first time I'd ever seen them. And that, everything else kind of grew from there.
Wow. What year do you think that would have been?
That was November of 1980. We did it in an ice storm. And he was completely undaunted. He had never met me before. And he said, yeah, we're going to go anyway. And we spent the whole day out there.
Okay, so you take your first tour out there in 1980. I know you've been working on this book for a long time. How long have you been working on the book?
I never set out to be a writer. I never thought of myself as a writer. But I did decide to write an article on the true story of John Buford at Thoroughfare Gap. So if you go back to the Killer Angels and Michael Schar's conversation about, talking to his brigade commanders on June 30th, the night of, about what we did at Thoroughfare Gap. Man, this is a great story.
Yeah.
If it was true, and of course it's not.
Yeah.
And so I did that in 1984, and then a couple of years later, Harold Howard was doing his series on Virginia battles and leaders in the Virginia Regimental series. And John suggested to me, I'd never considered doing it, that I do a book for that series.
Mm-hmm.
And so John and I did the story that he knew, there was no template for it in a lot of ways. Bill Nye's book has a chapter and a half, I think, on these battles, maybe two chapters. Right. So there had never been a book-length study. And so we looked at it, and a lot of it all made sense as John knew it and Bill Nye had done it. But some things didn't make sense. Some things, even after I wrote the book, didn't make sense to me. And so when I would do tours, there were some areas out there we can talk about, which I knew weren't right, but I didn't have the evidence to tell me how to fix them. And then the book came out, it did very well. It was one of the best-selling books in that series. It's been long out of print. It was well beyond the price on the secondary market of most anybody that wanted to buy a copy of it.
Sure was, yeah.
And so I got thinking of another project after another book had come out, and I knew, and we're going to talk about it probably, or we can talk about it now, that arguably the most important assumption we've made of that period of time in the campaign was wrong. And it was a big enough, because it was a story told before me, it was a story I told, it was a story everybody had told after me. And once I knew without any doubt in my mind that we had all got it wrong, I figured it was time to fix that. And that just led into what I hope is a much better, not just a better, more accurate story, but a much better written book than the first one.
Well, do you want to tackle that big assumption now, or would you rather avoid the spoiler alert and kind of get into the story? How do you want to do that?
However you want to do it.
No, you're the guest. You're the guest. What do you think? Do you want to I mean, you've already kind of wetted everybody's whistle by saying the number one thing they think they know is probably wrong. I don't think we can leave them hanging. Should you, do you want to go there?
All right. Well, the story has always been based on the official records. Lincoln, Stanton, Henry Halleck, and Joseph Hooker had all agreed that they needed the Union Cavalry, Alfred Pleasanton's Cavalry Corps, to go to the Shenandoah Valley and find Lee's army. So and this is based on what was put into the official records. And what was put in there on the night of June 16, morning of June 17, are, I believe, 13 messages, telegrams, that passed between those parties, Hooker, Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck. And the perception has always been from those is that they were all in agreement, and Hooker was going to order his cavalry to the Shenandoah Valley to find Lee's army. I knew when I wrote the book in the early 90s that there was another side to this.
Okay.
And that's the Alfred Pleasanton version. Now we could talk, you and I could talk about Alfred Pleasanton the rest of the night and probably put a pretty good discussion together. But when I was writing the book, and what I'm referring to there is his testimony before the Committee on the Conduct of the War. Everybody said, well, you can't believe anything Alfred Pleasanton wrote, so you need to disregard that.
Okay.
And that was the theory and for most people still is the theory of Alfred Pleasanton. And so I did, and there was at the time, and the hard part of doing this really is admitting to how much I got wrong, all those years ago. But I did have one other piece of evidence at the time, and that was that Ulrich Dahlgren, an aide to Joseph Hooker at the time, had written in his memorandum book something that actually confirmed exactly what Pleasanton said to the Committee on the Conduct of the War. So on June 17th, he confirms what Pleasanton says months later. But again, it just didn't seem I didn't have the experience, the confidence, however you want to put it at the time, that I was going to go against all of the folks who had gone before me.
Right. How could they all be wrong? Right.
Exactly. Well, so I told the standard story, and everybody has told the standard story since then. Over the intervening 30 years, one, I became much more comfortable, and most importantly, at the National Archives. And I found two pieces of information, and a very good friend of mine who you had a chance to meet, the late Horace Newborn, who was the Mosby authority, found the other piece. So what I found were two telegrams on June 17th that played into this. So one of them's from Ulrich Dahlgren, and one of them is from essentially Joseph Hooker, although it's actually from one of his aides, Butterfield or Seth Williams, in response to that. And so what happens is Hooker sends, he leaves all of his superiors thinking he's going to do what he's told to do. And then he sends Dahlgren to Pleasanton on the morning of June 17th with a verbal message. Now, of course, we live in an age of conspiracy theories. I don't want to read too much into this, but you can make an assumption as to why there would be a verbal message. It's not even written on a piece of paper that would survive. No one, Pleasanton's not in the area of a telegraph key. He's not going to receive one, but Hooker could have written something out to him and given it to Dahlgren to deliver. He doesn't do that. So we don't know what he tells them, except that he has to then, Dahlgren, go back to the telegraph key. The nearest one, I believe, is in Centerville. And he then has to tell Hooker what Pleasanton told him. So then we know that Pleasanton has told him, do not go west of Aldie. You are to stay east of Bull Run Mountain, and you are not to enter the Loudon Valley. Well, you can't get to the Shenandoah Valley unless you enter and cross the Loudon Valley.
Right.
So Dahlgren goes back and he tells Hooker this, and he said, Pleasanton wants to go into the Loudon Valley. And he said he puts therefore we have a time on the message, and it's around, I think, noon or 1 o'clock. And he tells us pretty much where Pleasanton is when he meets him, which is around Sudley Church, up around the Manassas battlefield.
Okay.
So the idea is that Hooker wants Pleasanton to stay there. Well, that's about 9 miles east of Aldie, which is the entrance to the Loudon Valley. That's exactly what Pleasanton told the Committee on the Conduct of the War. Exactly what he told them months later.
And now you've got
the only way to get back and answer Dahlgren is by telegraph. So Dahlgren waits there for an answer, and while he is there, he makes the note in his memorandum book that I had seen years earlier. He said that Pleasanton wants to enter the Loudon Valley, and again, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, and says it's the smart thing to do. You should do it. He said, the dust that we're putting up, the cavalry's putting up, gives our position away. The enemy will know where we are. So why stop on the wrong side of a mountain, a mountain gap? that you might have to fight your way through the next day if you can take it now without a fight. The response comes back, and it says that orders are being sent to you, or sent to Pleasanton. They will leave here about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, telling him to stay east of Aldie. So there's 2 more, so you got 4 pieces of evidence. But the order never arrives. The 4 o'clock order never arrives. Now, one, by the time it could have arrived, Pleasanton is already, now this is important to understand this. So the idea is always that he disobeyed Hooker's orders to not go looking for the enemy, right? We've always said, oh, his task as a cavalryman was to look for the enemy. He didn't do it. Actually, what he did is he disobeyed Hooker's orders so that he could go looking for the enemy. All right, that's the important part of this. We've completely got this wrong over the years. But the order at 4 o'clock had never been found. It's not in the ORs. The 2 items that I mentioned to you before with Dahlgren are not in the ORs. As historians, we put way too much faith in the idea that everything is in the official records, and the official records way too much.
Yeah.
So then, Horace Mewborn found that order. So that order is captured famously by John Mosby.
And is that what you refer to in the book is the open sesame? Is that what that is?
Yes.
Okay.
Years later, Mosby will write about the capture, and that is his phrase for it.
Yeah, right.
Sesame to all of Hooker's plans.
Right.
Now, when that's captured, if Pleasanton had done what he was told and stayed east of Aldie, the officers carrying that order would have been well within the Union lines. They had every reason to believe when they stopped for dinner at this house, they were safe. And they knew they were stopping in a Unionist home. So put them together and they had every reason to believe they're safe. But in fact, Pleasanton has gone beyond Aldie. There's been the Battle of Aldie. That's now over probably at the point this happens. And there's actually an estimate in the ORs, about 600 yards, I think it says, outside the Union lines. Mosby being, the word that comes to mind right now is opportunist. That almost sounds too flippant. He had other plans for that day. He hears the guns. He goes to the sound of the guns. And he sees these officers' horses at this house, captures the 2 men, finds the order so that it never gets to Pleasanton.
Okay.
And that order, the very first line of that order, and in my mind, that means that was the most important thing to Hooker, is under no circumstances will you advance beyond Aldie. Under no circumstances will you advance beyond Aldie. So again, there's no chance that he can get to the Shenandoah Valley and find Lee's army, get to the Blue Ridge, get anywhere near that if he stays east of Aldie. Pleasanton doesn't see that until the next day. And I don't want to get too far ahead. I'll just say this and then we'll move on. He will disobey his orders to do the right thing a second time on June 18th. So he precipitates the battle. It's a battle that is unexpected. Neither side expects to meet the other on June 17th. Having done that, he still wants to get out to the Shenandoah Valley, and he sends 2 brigade strength reconnaissance parties out to do that. Again, the perception has always been that he recalls them in the afternoon because he got scared. He thought he was being led into a trap and all that kind of stuff. In actuality, what happens, one of the orderlies who's captured by Mosby escapes. He gets back and he tells them, look, this is what happened. That order's been captured. And they reissue the order, they being Hooker and his aides. And now when that second copy, which I've never seen, arrives, Pleasanton knows he's really going out on the hook. He's disobeyed us twice, and he brings his men back.
Okay.
So that is what I call in the book Hooker's ruse.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go next. You talk about Hooker's ruse, and then you also talk about, he quote unquote sought to deceive his superiors, kind of thing. Can you just clarify though for the listeners? Because one of the things I think is interesting about the Aldie, Middleburg, Upperville aspects of the Gettysburg campaign is, I think, other than the names, probably most Gettysburg enthusiasts really don't know this stuff in detail at all. So we've gone in and we've already kind of led off with Hooker's ruse and some of the discrepancy between him and Pleasanton. But can you just clarify again to summarize, what is Hooker trying to do? What's Fighting Joe up to?
Hooker designed, and I'm not an expert on the Chancellorsville campaign, and I know you probably know more than I do, and you can tell me your own view on here. Designs what I've seen described as a brilliant plan for his spring campaign. It's very grandiose. There's a lot of moving pieces and parts. And of course, one of those is what we know now is the Stoneman raid.
Okay.
And then he has this embarrassing defeat. He lays it pretty much entirely at the hands of the cavalry and George Stoneman.
Yeah.
And he vows this is not going to happen again. When I say he is not going to send his cavalry off on a long jaunt away from the army. Somehow, as he gets closer in the campaign, so the campaign we generally look at it starting June 3rd. He begins moving his army on June 13th. He has a meeting with his corps commanders to include Pleasanton that day. Of course, he divides them into the two wings of the army, and your listeners are going to be pretty familiar with all that. The Western wing is under John Reynolds. They're going to follow pretty much the line of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad going north. They're going to be closer to the enemy, and Pleasanton is under Reynolds's orders. So Pleasanton at this point, all the way up to Gettysburg, has two bosses, Hooker and Reynolds. Both of them are convinced that there will be an attack through Thoroughfare Gap. So very much like what happens at Second Manassas. And on that day, at that time, Reynolds tells Pleasanton, you will have at least one brigade of cavalry watching Thoroughfare Gap. At times, he has two brigades there. And that's the fear. So they expect an attack through Thoroughfare Gap. Hooker is not going to let his cavalry corps go off on a jaunt to the Shenandoah Valley. He wants to hold them back as a protective force so that there's not another surprise a la Jackson's attack on the first day at Chancellorsville.
Okay. Got it. Good. We also dived right in with Alfred Pleasanton. Over the years, I've really started to appreciate Pleasanton as a fascinating guy. He doesn't get a ton of coverage if you think about it in most Gettysburg campaign studies, and obviously he gets.
I swear that he's the newspaper headline grabber there, right?
Well, let's talk about that because when we were putting this together, I found a 2022 email from you to me where you said you were going to quote unquote fix my opinion of Pleasanton. I think Pleasanton's an interesting guy. You literally open page 1 of the book with quote, a small, neat, dapper, dashing fellow. And to your point about the newspapers, on my tours and that, I always refer to him as the knight of romance and that sort of thing. So what is your take on Pleasanton? First, from a personality perspective, is the impression of him as a glory hunting newspaper hound? Is that accurate? And then maybe go second from there into what's your professional assessment of him, especially professional assessment during this phase of the campaign?
I can only say this, I'll say this as strongly as I can right up front. I categorically disagree with the assessment of him as a newspaper headline grabbing glory hunter. Years ago, when that developed, of course, when it develops in a May 12th letter from Captain Adams in the 1st Massachusetts. He's the one that accuses him of that. And I've spent 30 years looking at the context of all the criticisms of Pleasanton. I know I'm not going to change everybody's mind, looking at the nuances of it, who said what, why they said it. Now we have newspaper databases. We can go online and we can absolutely find objectively the evidence for that statement. It's either there or it's not there. If he's a newspaper glory hound, then you should be able to type in Alfred Pleasanton in a newspaper search engine and just have your printer spit out all kind of information. It's not there. There is nothing to support that. Now, we'll spend all the time you want on this, but I'm going to jump a little bit and then you can pull me back. I don't know how long you want to take this. I look at this another way as well. If he did, now we look at this and go, well, certainly there were some glory hounds in his cavalry corps, right? Judson Kilpatrick had a newspaper correspondent who actually worked as an aide for him from time to time. When Custer comes in, Custer is going to be one of those folks. I look at it a couple different ways. One, I wish Pleasanton was a newspaper glory hound because we would know more about him. That description you just read off there is only one of two I've ever seen of him. If he was talking to these newspaper correspondents all the time, I think we would have a better idea of who he is. And I wish we did. It would make it easy to understand him. Now, the other thing is, I always go back to a movie from the 1980s, The Right Stuff. That's the story. I don't know if you remember or ever saw it about the early national pop. And one of the lines in there is no Bucks, no Buck Rogers. So go back a year to 1862. The expense of the cavalry was they were going to be disbanded. They were being disbanded. On the eve of the Peninsula Campaign, the War Department begins to shut down the cavalry. They're not going to enlist anymore. They're not going to accept any more regiments. They send men into other units. Now, the Peninsula Campaign changes that. But if you look at, we have no idea 160 years later how the idea of that played on the minds of the cavalry. So if they are in the spotlight, it's going to make it harder than when you consider the continuing expense of the cavalry, horses, separate weapons. They all needed to be armed separately from the infantry, all the other expenses to be done away with. And that, I'm not saying that was his motive. I'm not saying it was anybody else's motive. But when you get people like Custer who at some point are going to become a national figure, it's a little harder to disregard the cavalry than if the public appreciates them. And so I don't say for 1 second that I've ever seen anything that was Pleasanton's motive, but I could certainly believe it if it was. Does that make any sense to you?
Oh yeah. Military history is filled with many examples of general officers doing what they're doing to try to promote their branch of service or whatever the case might be. So yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you're right. And to me, that's always been a little bit of a puzzle too, because if Pleasanton is really this dapper sort of dashing newspaper hound, I want to know more about him. And yet you don't know more. You don't read about him anywhere. And when you do look it up, you don't find much. So I can't argue with your assessment on that front.
We have to wonder why, if we don't read much, we continue to just spit that. We say that all the time.
Yeah, because the one or two things we have about him just repeat the same thing over and over, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, obviously there is some of his, as a good Gettysburg scholar, right? There's some of his Gettysburg testimony before the Joint Committee, which comes off as self-serving, telling Meade, for example, I'll give you 15 minutes, boss, to show me your commanding general kind of thing. So we do have some hints of that. So professionally, I know I shouldn't say a lot, but I know a number of Gettysburg historians who, for lack of a better word, kind of portray Pleasanton as at best a glory hunter, at worst incompetent. Professionally, what's your personal assessment of Pleasanton?
Well, here I think when we understand what we just talked about a few minutes ago,
Mm-hmm.
that should change our assessment of him, at least to a certain degree here.
Mm-hmm.
We say he's a terrible intelligence officer.
Right. Right.
And he is not great. I'm not going to defend him there. I don't. Again, if you look at it, and maybe I'm some hardcore haters will say I'm too defensive of him, but if he's an aide most of his career, he's not a field officer. So out west before the war, he's an adjutant for General Harney. He's not doing a lot of field work, building these skills. And then when he gets to the Army of the Potomac, he's working under McClellan. He's actually part of McClellan's headquarters escort for the Peninsula Campaign with the 2nd Cavalry. Well, McClellan never put a lot of focus on intelligence gathering because he had Alan Pinkerton.
Right.
He didn't want his cavalry.
He didn't want cavalry doing that. Right.
So, and then he continues through the Maryland campaign with Pleasanton, with McClellan, and McClellan keeps him on a short tether. So he's never been asked to really do this. And then we measure him against Jeb Stuart. And that's not fair because Jeb Stuart could reach into his division and find, dozens of men who had grown up and known every county they were moving through intimately.
Yeah.
And so they could find whatever they needed to find and be told whatever they needed to be told. And Pleasanton has to, he's in enemy territory the whole time. Any Union cavalry officer was going to be in enemy territory. So in this campaign, we say, well, he's not looking for the enemy. Well, in fact, he was. His orders were to not, to protect the army, a screening role first, not a scouting role. So he was picketing Thoroughfare Gap with a brigade. He's picketing the Rappahannock River with 3 brigades. And he does go scouting. They go out to the Blue Ridge Mountains. There are patrols that go out there. There are cavalry from Stahl's Cavalry Division that go all the way to Front Royal and beyond. The problem is they're all a day later, a day too late or a day too early.
Okay.
So they always seem to miss what was there a day later. Now, what he cannot do well, and there's no hiding it, is he cannot seem to synthesize the information he gets. And whether that's because of his ego, whatever, or just incompetence, it's really hard to say. He comes up with some really cockamamie ideas, and they call him on it. Halleck and others will call him on it at times and say, this. And so Reynolds gives him the order, look, quit relying on others. Go send your cavalry out, and you tell us what your men see. Well, once they begin fighting, that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Once the fighting begins on June 17th, they're not going to get out to do that. And at some point, the picket line was so strong that Jeb Stuart will say, I can't get any of my scouts through the Union picket line. Well, if they couldn't get through, I don't think any Union scouts are going to get through the other way. So there are some, you just can't make these broad statements. You have to look at the context and the nuance of it. Does he do some things well? Yes. Does he do some things poorly? Absolutely. And he doesn't help himself in that he's a regular officer in a volunteer army who probably has a very austere personality. The flashy uniform aside, he doesn't seem like he has a lot of, he's I guess for no other way to put it, a likable guy. He doesn't have a lot of close friends. He can be argumentative. He's going to take the regulars, hardcore discipline route more often than not. So he makes a lot of enemies. And people are going to look at, the idea of how they usurped Stoneman. That's another whole story that's in the book. So I don't think it's fair to paint an army officer with a broad brush like we have done, but there's good and there's bad with them, just like with everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I've dealt with that with Dan Sickles. Yes, folks, good and bad with Dan Sickles. You and I have dealt with that with George Armstrong Custer. Yes, folks, good and bad with George Armstrong Custer. I think this is the way more people should treat history, not he's all good, he's all bad. There's good points and there's bad points with him. Okay, so I don't, in the interest of time, because I do want to cover other stuff, I agree. I could sit here all night with you talking about Pleasanton, but so let's go to the fighting. So we've touched on Aldie, the 17th. You want to just give everybody a quick recap, what happens at Aldie, how does the action start, and then ultimately what's the significance or lack thereof and kind of the the fledgling campaign here?
Sure. The Federals are down around Manassas on the morning of the 17th. Pleasanton is still bringing his corps together to bring the men off the picket line. And it's important, I think, to say real quick that from the Battle of Brandy Station, the Federals had no rest. So they're still being rebuilt from the Stone Moraine. There is no, rest period for them. The South Stewart rests his cavalry division for the better part of a week before he begins moving. The day, June 17th, will be, and our friend Jeff Harding, did I just get the name right or wrong? The battlefield guide, I think, that's doing the work on the weather.
Jeff Harding.
Harding, okay.
Yeah. That's okay, Jeff.
He figured out probably.
I don't think Jeff listens to the show anyways, so we're okay on that. But anyways, so
too late for me to really get it into the book. They figured the temperature, the way that we would talk to the heat index today on June 17th in the afternoon was 118 degrees.
Wow.
We always knew it was hotter than blazing. 118, we can't imagine that today. So imagine fighting that and told it was going to take.
Yeah.
So that kind of sets that. They're moving from Manassas all the way. There's the question of whether they're going to go to Aldie or not. There's a halt somewhere around Sudley Church, where they have that interchange with Dahlgren, and then Pleasanton decides to disobey the order and go to Aldie. But they are not expecting to find the enemy. On the other side, Stewart had begun moving the day previously on June 16th. So he will send 3 brigades up from Culpeper County, and they will spend the night of June 16, June 17 in western, up along the Blue Ridge, out near Paris, Orleans, in that area. And then those 3 brigades, Mumford's brigade, which is Fitz-Lee's brigade, he's under the weather, Chambliss's brigade or Rooney Lee's brigade, and Robertson's North Carolinians. He's going to send them on the morning of the 17th to begin screening Lee's movement. Most importantly, Longstreet's movement, because Longstreet on the morning at that time is moving through the Loudoun Valley. He's actually east of the Blue Ridge. So they're going to block the gaps at Bull Run Mountain, at Thoroughfare Gap, and at Aldie Gap. If everything had happened one day differently, none of this probably would have happened. Now, of course, that's a counterfactual. We can't say for sure. But if Stewart enters the valley one day later, then Pleasanton would have gone through and gone north, out west and north, and there might not have been any fight. Neither side expects there to be a battle. The Confederates had already gone into bivouac for the night. They've separated their command, looking for food and for the horses and what have you. And then about 4:30 or so in the afternoon, the lead elements of both sides will clash right around the town of Aldie. And the significance of Aldie is that Stewart wants to, both sides are essentially tasked with screening, protecting their own army. That's what Hooker wants Pleasanton to do. Pleasanton will disobey and take a scouting role. Stewart is screening Lee's army. So he's going to, by moving east to the Bull Run Mountain across the Loudoun Valley, he can trade time for space. If he gets confronted by the enemy, he can fall back slowly, allow Lee to move north through the area, and still achieve his goal. And that's what he looks to do. Aldie controls the two hard surface roads across the Loudon Valley. So they're not in great shape at this point of the war, but these were two turnpikes macadamized in the 1863 term of macadamized. They were rock surface roads, very smooth when they're maintained. The easiest way to get across the valley would have been those two roads. They had the best bridges, everything else. So if the Federals want to get to the Blue Ridge, they need either the Snickersville Turnpike going kind of northwest from Aldie, or they need the Little River Ashby's Gap Turnpike going due west from Aldie to the Blue Ridge. And so by blocking the gap, Stuart knows he controls those two roads. And conversely, that's why Pleasant wants to get through it. He wants to control the roads. It makes no military sense for either man to ignore that town. Fighting gets going around 4:30, probably. And one of the things, Jim, that I really came to appreciate here in doing this and working with some reenactors and folks that have, I don't call myself a horseman. I've spent some time on a horse, but I don't consider myself a horseman. Is that I think some of us have an erroneous idea of cavalry combat. You know, we talk about Brandy Station as 14 hours of cavalry combat, but they weren't charging up and down for 14 hours. And they certainly weren't going to do it in 118-degree heat. These battles just did not last as long as we think they do. And, you know, as cavalry historians, I think all of us have been pretty negligent in ignoring the horses in our studies of cavalry combat.
Yeah, agree.
And they're going to take a terrible toll in this heat. So the fight begins on two roads. The Confederates, Munford's command, and we can maybe talk about Munford later on, I think, splits his command, or is split for him to watch both of those turnpikes. They can't see each other. It's kind of the base of a triangle, three-sided triangle there. The Confederates have the wide end of it, the western end. They're going to defend both roads. The fight develops on the Little River Ashby's Gap Turnpike, as you alluded to, what we call the Haystacks fight. Probably only lasts 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
And then the heavier fight will develop on the Snickersville Turnpike, which for the Federals is, and as cavalry fighting goes at this point in the war, becomes kind of a bloodbath for them. In terms of how it impacts the campaign, the Battle of Aldie is going to pretty much wreck Kilpatrick's brigade. Now, it will continue through the fighting in the Loudon Valley, but it's not going to continue really. You know, the first Rhode Island will be wrecked later on. The first Massachusetts is, the first Rhode Island doesn't even continue beyond D.C. and Alexandria. It doesn't cross the Potomac River. The first Massachusetts is only going to be good as a headquarters escort for the Sixth Corps, and the rest of the brigade is shot up enough that they're going to stay down at Westminster pretty much to guard the supply point there. So they're out of, you know, that's a brigade that could have done who knows what, you know, on July 3rd and some of the fighting. And once they get contact, whatever plans either commander had, Hooker or Lee, change.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that contact point and the fighting that follows changes all of their plans. And we'll talk about it later, but I'll just throw it out here. As I think the biggest thing is, I'm not aware, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there's an idea that Stuart's going to go off on his ride prior to the fighting in the Loudon Valley.
Yeah.
So, you know, but for the fighting, he would have just continued to screen the army going north up the Bull Run, Catoctin line of mountains. They might have fought somewhere else as they, you know, as the two sides tried to get a view of each other. But if he doesn't go off on a ride, of course, and if I'm right, then it changes what happens at Gettysburg, arguably immensely.
Mm-hmm. Well, you touched on at least three things there that I wanted to ask you. So I'm going to ask and try to make sure I remember them all. Just for the sake of the listeners, you want to just touch on tactics a little bit? So Aldie, are we talking mounted saber charges? Are we talking dismounted action? Are we talking a little bit of both? Is there any horse artillery thrown in? What kind of fight are we talking about?
So that's a good question. There's a bit of everything. There is horse artillery involved. Jim Breathitt's battery of Stewart's horse artillery is there. Allison Randall's battery of Union horse artillery is there. There is dismounted fighting, so the Confederates are going to fight dismounted at the Haystacks. There's a squadron of cavalry there. It was 5th Virginia Cavalry left behind on a small knoll. It's got a couple of big haystacks on it, hence the name. And they're just left there as a rallying force. The South doesn't have enough carbines to arm all the men, and we can talk about it later on maybe, a complete, I think, misunderstanding of how well the Union cavalry was armed at this point in the war. But what Stuart did was to group his carbines into 1 or 2 companies. The Federals would scatter them 10 or 15 to a company, so that each company had some. Stuart did it a little bit differently, and Tom Rosser will take those 2 companies of his regiment, use them as a rallying force on this piece of high ground, but then he's not able to support them. Mm-hmm. So they will be surrounded and overrun by mounted Union cavalry attacks. Supposedly, this is the first time a force of that size in Stuart's cavalry has surrendered in combat. There's a word that that Rosser court-martialed the officer after he got out of Union prison camp, but very few Confederate court-martials survived, so we can't be sure of that. There is all mounted fighting by the Federals along the Snickersville Turnpike, but they're going to pretty much wreck themselves fighting dismounted. Again, different regiments, the 2nd and 3rd Virginia, are going to put their dismounted carbineers at a very strong position. Tom Mumford called it the strongest position, I think he said, in 50 miles. They have a bend in the road. They've got a stone wall that creates an angle there. They're perfectly protected. They got an artillery piece firing from a high spot over their heads, and they absolutely tear up the Union cavalry attacking up the road. So there's a little bit of everything in probably a very short piece of time. This is a very intense piece of combat.
And you mentioned Mumford. One of the things I like about the book, and I like about books like this in general, but you do such a great job at it, is, you're introducing us to people that most of us know from the Gettysburg campaign, but you're introducing us to these people prior to the campaign. So it gives us an opportunity to see him in a different light. But you want to just tell us a little bit about him, who he is, and kind of where he fits in the order of battle?
Yeah, Mumford is a guy that I think intrigues Southern cavalry historians or cavalry historians in general. He should. Because there's always a question of when he gets promoted or if he gets promoted to brigadier. In 1862, Stuart, he doesn't like 2 men. I think we have an idea that the Stuart's cavalry division was just this big happy family that they all got along, and that's unrealistic to think that anybody and that many men is going to do that. Stuart had 2 men he absolutely despised: Beverly Robertson and William Grumble Jones.
Right.
He wanted them gone. He wanted them gone from the earliest moment. And he tried hard, I think, to get Mumford promoted to replace Jones, and it doesn't happen. And another opportunity will arise to do the same thing. And Stuart, while he supported him pretty vigorously the first time, offers only lukewarm support of him the second time. He actually puts his weight behind Tom Rosser. None of them at the moment will get promoted. They'll both, Rosser will be promoted later on. So then the question is why the change? Well, Stuart, of course, doesn't survive the war, so we don't know what he might have said or explained later on.
Right.
Mumford does, and luckily for us, says a lot. And luckily for me, He wrote a lot about Aldie. He really, and I agree with him. He got screwed by Stuart. They dislike each other enough that Stuart ignores what he does there. So he wrote about it a lot. He got Union officers to correspond with his men and with him. So he got learn a lot because of that. But I think Munford, and I stress think, is probably indiscreet. He is a VMI graduate, and I don't mean that to say that that's why he's indiscreet, but Stuart is a West Pointer.
Yeah.
So I think he feels that he is slighted because of that, because he didn't go to West Point. He sees the two Lees, Rooney and Fitz, get promoted ahead of him, and I think he sees that as a bit of, nepotism or brown nosing of Robert E. Lee by Stuart to his expense. And when I say indiscreet, I just don't think he's afraid to say this. He doesn't know when, probably to keep his mouth shut might have done him better. He will say after the war, I believe, that Stuart was as ambitious as Caesar. So you get a sense that they didn't like each other. And then coming into this, and this is something I wish we knew more of. At Brandy Station, Munford is close by, where he could hear the fighting, but doesn't arrive until late. And Stuart is very upset about this. And eventually, Munford says, look, the orders I received were confusing and ambiguous. And in time, probably, when he writes the book after Stuart's dead, Henry McClellan, Stuart's aide, will agree with Munford and say the orders work. He will defend Munford. But I think Stuart is very upset. And so when they come east to Aldie, I think there's doubt in Stuart's mind who he wants to command that brigade. And at some point, I think he actually divides the command of that brigade. Divides it essentially officially for that day, telling Munford, you'll have half the brigade and you'll defend the Snickersville Turnpike and Williams Wickham. Who doesn't do well, his regiment doesn't do well at Brandy. I think Stuart wants to see if he's the candidate to command it. He divides it and says, you'll defend the Little River Ashby's Gap Turnpike. And all that plays out. When he writes his report, he completely ignores Tom Munford.
Yeah.
Sends him off to guard the Snickersville Turnpike, and so he doesn't play another role in it. Now, sending him off to do singular duty may say, look, I don't like him, but I still respect him. But either way, he sends him off where he's not there. And as you said, we don't really hear from him, much going forward.
Right. Okay. So in the interest of time, how does Aldie lead to Middleburg, and tell us what happens in Middleburg?
Well, on the 18th, in disobedience of his orders, Pleasanton sends out the 2 reconnaissances. And one of those, J.I. Gregg's brigade, John Irvin Gregg's brigade, will go out to Middleburg and get a mile west of there to a place we now call Mount Defiance. Okay. And there'll be some heavy skirmishing around there. And that's where the order arrives, telling Pleasanton, you shouldn't have done this, essentially, and they bring him back. But as things progress, Hooker realizes now that if Jeb Stuart's cavalry is there and is fighting as tenaciously as they are, then something has to be there. Something being Lee's army.
Right.
So he will slowly and begrudgingly begin to release the tether on Pleasanton.
Okay.
And so he allows him to go back to Middleburg on the 19th. Now, of the 3 battles, this in some ways is the smallest. There's only, I hate to measure battles by casualties, but there's almost exactly 100, as near as I can figure, per side. It's really a long skirmish, mostly dismounted. Ultimately, Stuart will be shoved off the position by mounted Union attacks. And the Confederates would say, and Stuart would rightly say, I didn't get shoved off anywhere. I fought as long as I could. I delayed them as long as I could. And I retreated when I chose to retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly legitimacy in saying it and looking at it that way. But by the time he retreats, he only goes a short distance. You can see him on the next ridge. The Federals know where he is. And as the 20th comes and goes, there's no fighting on the 20th. But there's a lot of discussion. And now I think Hooker knows we've got to get to the Blue Ridge. We've got to find out what's there. And so that all leads into the much larger Battle of Upperville, the much more dramatic battle. And just real briefly, because the idea has been percolating that Stuart has mounted infantry. This starts back at Brandy Station, and it's not that old Alfred Pleasanton that says it. It's John Buford that first says it, the man that we all respect. So we just can't say that's Pleasanton, making things up. But the tenacity of the fighting at Aldie, with the men behind stone walls and the Confederates fighting dismounted, and again at Middleburg, plays into this idea. And they think again that they're fighting mounted infantry, that the Stuart's defense is so tenacious that they need infantry. And so that will lead into Strong Vincent's brigade being part of the fight at Upperville on the 21st.
Yeah, you actually just took my next question, right? Because we think of these strictly, the laymen typically think of these strictly as cavalry actions. And here we have some infantry being involved. Strong Vincent in particular. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know the 16th Michigan, I think, plays a big part in this. You want to just talk a little bit about what Vincent's guys do in general?
And so I'm sure all your viewers know this is one of the most famous brigades in the Army of the Potomac.
That's why I had it on my list of questions. Yeah.
Joshua Chamberlain is not there.
Whoa, stop the presses. What? He didn't win this one single-handedly too? Oh my God.
He's either down with sunstroke or malaria or something.
I think Buster Kilrain has him in the tank, the hot, damn, dirty dust, So, okay, I'll stop interrupting. Go on.
That's all right. So Pleasanton gets Hooker allows Meade to send a division to assist the cavalry. And then there's concern they don't want to really bring on a much bigger fight there. If you get a whole division of infantry involved, that's going to bring infantry from Lee.
Mm-hmm.
So one brigade goes forward, there's another brigade in support. It's Vincent's brigade, and they come up with a plan, whereas Vincent will carry the attack in the morning, try to confront the cavalry, Stuart's cavalry head on, sweep around Stuart's right flank. The Federals will wait in part to take advantage of a rout if it happens. So there's an etching done probably on scene by Wad that just shows the Union cavalry standing there, in line of battle while the battle can be seen. Well, they're waiting to take advantage of it. And then Buford goes around their left flank. So they're hoping for a very quick victory there, get Stuart running, keep him running with the cavalry, and it doesn't happen. Again, Stuart does a magnificent job through all of this. He fights, retires when he needs to retire, so he's not being overwhelmed, not being pinned down to where he can't escape. Draws this thing out for about 10 hours that day. And the Vincent's infantry, again, it's not 118 degrees, but it's not cool by any stretch. It's cooler. There's been some rain finally, but they have been marching from well east of Aldie. So they start well east of Aldie. It's 6 miles to Middleburg from Aldie. It's a mile from Aldie to Mount Defiance. And they're going to fight all the way from there to Goose Creek, another few miles up the road, and they're doing this all on foot. So there's a series of skirmishes from where they first made contact west of Mount Defiance. There's another creek there at Cromwell's Run, and then there's Rector's Crossroads, and then there's Goose Creek. all of these are looked at kind of as separate combats in the morning and early afternoon. And then by the time the Federals push across Goose Creek, the infantry is spent. They just cannot be expected to go any farther. And it now becomes a pure cavalry combat, which is, I like to say, if I knew I wasn't going to get shot, it would have been something spectacular to see. All of the cavalry in both commands, minus one brigade each. So Munford's brigade isn't there. John Taylor's brigade is en route, but doesn't get there in time. All of them are fighting, except those two brigades, within a very small, nothing like it happens to Brandy Station. Now,
I was going to ask. Yeah.
It's a bigger battlefield at Brandy Station. It's harder to see see things happening great distance. For 15 to 30 minutes, the end of the fight at Upperville is quite honestly, I think, a bigger, much more dramatic cavalry fight than Brandy Station. So make sure I understand that, so I don't get all the Brandy Station folks. It's for a very short period of time, but they could see everything. David Gregg said later on, he said, from where he was watching it, it was an inspiring sight to see all of the cavalry scattered out like this. It would have been, as I say in the book, I think, like a Napoleonic painting. I think it would have been something to see.
Any idea how many casualties on this one?
That's the largest of the three. I have a figure in my head for all three together.
Right.
So if you look at the campaign of those 5 days of fighting, it's more than 800 men lost for the Federals, killed, wounded, and captured. More than 600 for the South, killed, wounded, and captured. You put that together with Brandy Station, those figures are almost exactly the same. So the Federals lose 800 plus at Brandy. The South loses, I think, 600 plus, give or take, at Brandy. So both sides have lost at least a brigade of cavalry, manpower-wise, not horse-wise, manpower-wise,
right,
between the fighting in the Loudon Valley of Brandy Station going into continuing the campaign. And the horse losses are much, that we can't accurately quantify them. But I know that going from Brandy, when the Union Army moves north, they have between 1,000 and 1,500 dismounted cavalrymen who are moving north with horses that they just received that are unshod. None of those men participate in the Loudon Valley fighting. So they have 1,500 men at that point. And I'm probably cut me off whenever. But the demand for horses was so severe at this point in the war that they had to lower the standards of what they would accept, the Federals. So they went from 6-year-old minimum to 5-year-old minimum, and Pleasanton will write during the Loudon Valley fighting to the Army Quartermaster, the 5-year-old horses you gave out on me pretty much immediately.
Yeah.
So in the heat, they're not being unsaddled, they're not being fed properly, there's not a lot of water out there. The horse losses, I'm not saying killed, I'm saying just lost to the men. That meant men were going back dismounted. It's really hard to quantify, but it had to have been staggering.
Wow.
And the same thing for Stuart. Stuart has the same challenges. He says in his report months later that the fighting in the Loudon Valley on those stone turnpikes had lamed his horses so bad that many of them only had 100 men. So you figure what these men do later and all the cavalry movement and fighting that takes place in the campaign and the condition that the horses are in coming out of this.
Yeah. And I always say, right, that's a factor we don't consider in terms of the campaign itself. Our assessment of cavalry in the Gettysburg campaign typically goes something like Lee's invasion starts. Stuart goes off on his ride. They meet at East Cavalry Field, right?
Right.
And so,
Right.
we neglect Hanover, we neglect Hunterstown, we neglect Westminster, and we neglect all of this. Why do you think that is? Why do you think this stuff? I certainly think we're in an age where we're dissecting the Gettysburg campaign so deeply that I think there's an audience of people who want to do the pre-battle and the post-battle stuff. You and I were joking recently, as I say, historians seem to be making the Gettysburg campaign longer and longer with each book that comes out. But in terms of Aldie, Middleburg, Upperville, put it all together, what does it mean for the Gettysburg campaign? And, do you feel like it's sort of an unloved stepchild that doesn't get the attention that it deserves?
Well, in a sense, I agree with what you just said, the unloved stepchild, because it falls between Brandy Station and Gettysburg. So when soldiers have a chance to write, and they don't have a chance to write for the federal side, there's no rest for them between Brandy Station and Gettysburg.
Right,
there's not a lot of letters written.
Right.
So these battles are overshadowed in their mind. They write a Brandy letter, and then they write about Gettysburg. And so finding material on this fighting, now I found a lot more in over 30 years, but it's still, the wealth of material, is not there, certainly to the extent I wish it was. And it makes it hard to divine what they're talking about, little brief snippets of diaries and things like that. But probably, so we talked about the horse losses and the exhaustion of the horses. I alluded earlier to whether there would have been Stuart's ride or not. I think it comes out of this fighting. It's not planned before it. I'll be happy if someone shows me I'm wrong. And I don't need to explain that whole lot, but once he does it with exhausted animals, not only his men.
Right.
So if you read his report, he has to rest his horses every day for long periods of time. He can't make this a quick dash that he would have liked to do, probably. This is not the dash that he makes on the peninsula. And then everything, there's a trickle-down effect as he goes forward with that. So that, I think, is a significant difference in terms of how it impacts the campaign. The other thing, two other things, so I don't forget them, I'm going to tell you both now so you can remind me if I forget. One is morale, and two is the young officers that are promoted. So going forward, every cavalry historian has an idea of what they think the turning point is for the federal cavalry. And they have their own idea. And a lot of them are going to say Brandy Station. And I would argue that because at the end of the day at Brandy Station, no matter what the Federals did, they were the ones that retreated. They were the ones that yielded the field at the end of the day. They didn't do that at Upperville. They watched the Confederates run and run and run. Now, Stuart will say we walked and we walked and we walked. In a sense, they did. But at the end of the day, they didn't. They ran. And this was huge for the Federal cavalry. And what happens there is also huge for the Southern cavalry. When you look at letters and diaries written in the immediate day or two after the fighting, the Southern troopers' morale is really, really down. There's a lot of infighting between the officers. Who did what poorly, who did what well, who should have done this. A lot of bickering between the officers. And the men are just unhappy. They're not used to this. And not only that, they go up to the top of the Blue Ridge and it's cold and damp and wet and that is miserable night up there. And then there's a reporter up there who's been with Longstreet's infantry the whole time. And he writes this absolutely negative appraisal of Stuart's action. Completely misunderstands what Stuart was tasked with. And so you had this criticism of Brandy. It carries over with you here, and then it picks up again after Upperville, and it will pick up again after Stuart's ride in Gettysburg. And so it creates this long trough for the South that Stuart at least here, is completely unjust. Stuart does what he should have done, what he was told to do, and he does it magnificently. And no one appreciates it because they were not used to having their butt kicked like they did, the Federals thought they had done.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a morale issue there. It's just the opposite for the Federals. They go into the campaign with morale sky high. And I think you see that at Gettysburg, East Cavalry Field, the first day, wherever it is, you see something that might not have happened otherwise if things had gone differently. And then lastly, the three officers that are promoted, Custer, Farnsworth, and Merritt, this has a long-term effect on the cavalry. Of course, not in Farnsworth's case, but the other two are there for the remainder of the war. They're young, they're aggressive, and I think what Pleasanton has done is he has balanced the experience, the seniority, and the maturity of men like Buford and Gregg with young brigade commanders who will do whatever it takes to achieve victory on the field. And you see that at East Cavalry Field. I don't know that would have happened if those men aren't promoted. Certainly wouldn't have been with Custer.
Yeah, well, Bob, you just knocked out about 6 of my questions right there. So let me just kind of elaborate on a couple things because I want to make sure people know that you cover this in the book. Chapter 23, you discuss contemporary accounts that are critical of Stuart and the morale in the cavalry, which I think you kind of just alluded to and elaborated on right there. So I think you covered that question. So for the cavalry, just to sort of level set here, yeah, this whole idea of the Union cavalry coming of age in the Gettysburg Campaign. Some people put that coming of age as early as Brandy Station. Other people, or earlier. Some people put the coming of age with the 3 promotions. So would it be fair to say, in your opinion, that Aldie, Middleburg, and perhaps especially Upperville are critical moments in the coming of age story that maybe people haven't talked about enough? And I don't want to put words in your mouth. Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, they are, because Kilpatrick has just been promoted on the cusp of Aldie. He's promoted as a result of the Battle of Brandy Station. And, however this petition happens, Kilpatrick haters will say that he, connived it, and I can't say that he didn't. But the men of his brigade the officers of his brigade signed a big petition and gave it to Pleasanton saying, look, we want this guy to be a brigadier. And he sent back to the brigadier. Well, then they're going to get Stahl's division from the defenses of Washington, which Hooker and Pleasanton had wanted. And it would have made it easier to look at the Cavalry Corps as a corps. With 3 divisions, makes it easier for them to consider that a corps. And then you've got opportunity there to promote these men, to put, because I'm a Michigan guy, I'm a Michigan Brigade guy. I don't see Joseph Copeland at his age, and he's a lot younger than I am, so I'm not, but doing what you see on that painting right there. I mean, he's not going to have the same result, I don't think, at East Cavalry Field in the same scenario, everything else being equal. Things would have been different, I think. And Pleasanton at Upperville had been very disappointed in the command of the Reserve Brigade. It had gone back and forth from Brandy Station all the way through Upperville between 2 men, one of whom is mysteriously, we know what happens later on. We don't know why in the middle of a campaign they get rid of him, but they send him to Maine to a draft depot, Charles Jarvis Whiting. He's replaced by Starr. Starr's really more of an infantryman, I think, than a cavalryman in some respects. Pleasanton is unhappy with both of them. People say, oh, Pleasanton wasn't the battlefield commander. He's right there watching this fight. He's directing this fight. And he's just not happy with him. And he recommends Merritt in his report before he puts in, the June 29 letter
Yeah.
He asked for Merritt to be a brigadier right off the bat. He knows, we need a change, and these older guys aren't going to get it done. He had seen, and again, one of the things I screwed up, and I don't know if you caught it or not. As you said, we're both Custer guys. I am not a fan of Frederick Whitaker's biography of Custer. I don't put a lot of faith in it. And when I wrote the book the first time, I completely discounted the famous story about Custer going into the fight there at the fur farm.
Okay.
But I stand corrected on that. He did. There's no question in my mind that he did. More importantly, what we did not know was when Pleasanton recommends these men, and the letter he does it with is not in the ORs. He says with each one of them why, he says, for Custer, Aldie, and Upperville, for his actions of Aldie and Upperville. Well, we knew what the Aldie part of it was, we never knew what the Upperville part of it was. And things came to light through some pension accounts and post-war newspaper accounts that Custer will lead maybe as many as 3 attacks in the critical half hour at the end of the Battle of Upperville.
Wow.
So there's no doubt Pleasanton is there directing this. He can see this. He knows now that that Custer is a guy he can count on. Farnsworth is visible here, but he had been at Brandy Station. He'd taken a critical role at Brandy Station, and so those become his 3 choices. Farnsworth doesn't survive very long, but the other 2 have. We don't need to argue about their impact on the cavalry the rest of the war, and for as long as they lived, really.
Well, folks, boil coffee here. We're going to go into the second hour because I'm just coming up with too many questions as we're talking about this here. Boy, where to go there? Before I do get into another question, you've touched on a couple things. I want to make sure people understand. Bob O'Neill might be the most prodigious National Archive researcher I know, and I want to call that out right now before I forget about it later. Earlier in the talk, you talked about we can't rely on the ORs for everything, and frankly, we probably shouldn't as much as we do. But every time Bob O'Neill and I are exchanging emails or text messages, hey, let's do dinner, let's do lunch sort of thing, which we do all the time, right, Bob? Wink, wink. We either can't do it because I'm working or you're at the National Archives. You literally live at the National Archives. So I would challenge, if there are 3 Civil War researchers out there who know the collections of the National Archives better than you do, I'd love to meet those people. So I just want to call that out before we, before we do kind of run out of time here. But Custer, yeah, obviously we're 2 Custer guys. You touched a little bit on Upperville and that sort of thing. How much do you think or not think the Pleasanton-Custer relationship has been overlooked by scholars in Custer's rise? And, basically what I mean by that, I think in most Custer-themed works, the relationship maybe gets a page, maybe gets a couple of paragraphs, and then boom, he's the boy general and he's off and running, or that sort of thing. Do you think in general Pleasanton, I'm just curious what you think, is a role model? Do you think Pleasanton has a big impact on fledgling young George Custer beyond the fact that he's the guy who signed off on the promotion?
That's a terrific question. And it's a mystery to me, quite frankly, because I don't see either of them as the same person. They don't share the personality.
Okay.
Custer, I see, is this very outgoing, boy in a man's body type of thing, always looking to have fun. And as I said earlier, my idea of Pleasanton is rather austere, rather cold.
Yeah, which is a little surprising.
Which is why I think one of the reasons a lot of folks don't like him. And I don't mean folks today, I mean his contemporaries then. So how these 2 get along is a mystery to me. But it happened, I believe, very quickly. Now, what we have to remember, though, too, is that Custer is on McClellan's staff in the peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And Pleasanton has the 2nd Cavalry, which is on McClellan's headquarters escort for a period of time. So there's some, almost certainly, I don't think it's a leap of faith to say there's some familiarity with them.
Right. Interaction.
And Custer going back to that point.
Yeah.
So when Custer is sent to rejoin his command, which is the 5th Cavalry, the 5th U.S. Cavalry, in early May, the 5th Cavalry is off with Stoneman on the raid, and Pleasanton is back with the Army with his brigade. And so they, essentially Pleasanton said, look, why don't you stay with me, type of thing. And before you know it, he's on his staff. But I don't see them as two, guys just sitting around having, cutting up at night, or like I expect Custer to do, kind of.
Yeah.
Now, at times, I think Custer will later on in life get that kind of cold. His personality will change. But here,
yes.
I see him as completely different. So it seems odd on one hand, but I think you said it earlier. There's that famous photograph of them where they've kind of mimicked each other. Custer has outdone Pleasanton in his uniform with the gold braid and whatever. Pleasanton was a dapper man.
He does look good. Pleasanton looks good. He does.
He doesn't have a lot of the braid, and he doesn't go in for stuff. The Custer, he's just very well
manicured. Well groomed. Right.
He's very well tailored. And he's got the riding whip, which just absolutely other people ridiculed. He didn't carry a big cavalry saber. He carried a presentation sword. So they think, oh, he was never in combat, but that's not true. But they're not the same, because Custer, at some point has the big famous Toledo blade and other things. So it's hard to put them together, but they certainly were together, and they certainly respected each other.
Yeah.
But Custer doesn't say much about. He doesn't really say that much about Pleasanton. He says a little. But, the same way I said earlier that I wish we knew more about Pleasanton and he was in the newspapers.
Agree.
I wish that Custer said more about him, too, to explain, to answer your question.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the one common theme you see with Custer and McClellan, Custer and Pleasanton, and then Custer and Sheridan, I think you kind of have this, and then insert the general's name here, loves me the way a father loves a son kind of thing. So, I think Custer has that ability to just kind of ingratiate himself with the older guy above him. Like you say, at least during the Civil War. And as we know, his personality changes quite a bit later on. As many men's personalities change when they get older.
Sure. I mean, people, I hold myself up to that, but
I know I'm older and more.
They could count on Custer.
Yeah.
They needed something done. They could count on him. So
reliable.
The relationship always went both ways.
Yeah. And so, you've touched on the promotions again. I don't want to run too long and monopolize too much of your time, but I know the promotions is something you've done some work and some research on. When I was sort of just starting out as a fledgling Gettysburg historian, one of the things I heard from some historians, and I'm not going to mention names because I don't do that, but was along the lines of Pleasanton pushes these promotions through because he hates foreigners, and guys like Duffier are out because Pleasanton hates foreigners, kind of thing. And I can see you smirking a little bit. What do you think? Truth, myth, somewhere in between? What do you think of that? And was getting rid of guys like Duffier, was it warranted? Maybe that'd be another way too to ask that question.
So tell them to put more coffee on, because we could be here again for another hour. As that story goes, that story I think is completely false.
Mm-hmm.
I'll come back to that in a second. But in the general scheme of things, one, we characterize Pleasanton based on basically one letter. It's not like we have 100 letters or 200 letters that let us get into his head. We have one are two letters from him written at the same exact time, in which he says, I have no faith in foreigners. So that's June 23rd, I believe, that he writes those letters. And we base everything we say about him on that letter. And then we take that letter from June 23rd and go, well, that must explain June 11th. So we go back in time, and I just think that's patently unfair. But let's look at the context of what he's saying. One, it's after Chancellorsville. To have found somebody in the Army of the Potomac who go, oh, I love foreigners. I just think they're great, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Now, Pleasanton, however you believe the story, had been out at Hazel Grove.
Mm-hmm.
He had been and had an idea of watching the 11th Corps run. Now, I'm not going to get in to say that that's fair or unfair. It's probably
right. But he was there.
But he's there, so he has a sense of this. So that carries over, but that's the whole Army. And that carries over today. But more importantly is this. One, when he reorganizes the Army, they say that he got rid of Percy Wyndham, who was British, DeCesnola, who was Italian, and Duffier, who was French. Well, first off, he doesn't get rid of Pleasanton, period. Wyndham is wounded at Brandy Station, goes back to Washington to recover, and he gets an independent command. He gets essentially what will become the Cavalry Bureau as we know it after the Battle of Gettysburg. Wyndham is another whole character we spent a lot of time on. He desperately wanted an independent command. He thought he was smarter than everybody else. And he gets his independent command. It's not a battlefield command,
mm-hmm.
but he has the command and he does not want to give it up. So Pleasanton, this is always ignored, writes multiple letters ordering him back to his command. So to say that, and he has to threaten him with having him arrested to get him to come back. So to say that he gets rid of Wyndham is just completely wrong. Unarguably wrong in my thing. So now the other thing is this. How did most cavalry brigade and division commanders get their command? Through seniority rather than by decree. All right, so nobody said, Alfred Duffier, we are giving you we're going to promote you to Brigadier General. We're going to give you command of the 2nd Cavalry Division. They don't do that. He got it by seniority. When the senior officer was gone, Duffier took over as the next senior officer. And that infuriates Averill, the commander of the division, so much when he's gone that he comes back and he writes a letter saying this system has got to change.
Mm-hmm.
The next senior officer is not always the best choice.
Right.
We cannot continue to do this. That's another, he's going after Duffier there. All right. Duffier has a system, and I've got my own website. You can put it up there later on. I've got a story on there recently where I spend quite a bit of time explaining why Duffier deserved to be fired, in my view. All right. But when Pleasanton reorganizes the Corps from 3 divisions to 2, Duffier is the odd man out. And whatever his motive is, if you want to go all conspiracy and go, he's just lying, he hated foreigners, that's fine. But he had fought Stoneman's organization to Brandy Station. That was Stoneman's order of battle, 3 divisions, not Pleasanton's. He goes through the Battle of Brandy Station. He goes, look, I think it'll work better if I had 2 stronger divisions rather than 3 weak ones. And so he makes them stronger, and Duffier's the odd man out. He just goes back to where he should have been. He had it by seniority, not decree. He goes back to his brigade. That brigade had been led by DeCesnola by seniority. When Duffier left, DeCesnola stepped up. He had the brigade. When Duffier comes back, he goes back to his regiment. So he's really not firing anybody. Now, when he writes that letter, and this is what I don't think people realize. And again, Granted, it's me looking into this and going, this is what I think happened. He had every reason, one, to just absolutely despise Alfred Duffier. And that's in the book, and it's on the website, and you can see it all. I'm going to take time here. Duffier gets his regiment wrecked on June 18th. The 1st Rhode Island does not leave Alexandria and D.C. after, when the army moves north. And yet, Duffier gets a promotion to brigadier general. He is now Pleasanton's equal. He has done nothing but foul up at Brandy Station. He fouled up before that. He has screwed it up every time he's had an opportunity in command. And he goes to Washington, and he comes out a brigadier general. And Pleasanton learns of that the day he writes that letter. That's what's always overlooked. And I think Pleasanton had every reason to be absolutely furious, and I think we all would have been in the same case. If we had all been through and knew what he knew firsthand, I think we'd all been going, give me another beer. This is going to take a while, and it's so I just think we painted with too big a brush that whole story. And I told someone that I wish I had never put my name to it, because when I redid the book the first time, because now everyone quotes me as part of the process of who said this. And I just think it's completely wrong.
Well, I think we've shattered so many myths tonight that I think, folks, when you start quoting Bob O'Neill, and I got to make sure I hold this up straight for the camera. There we go. I think that's got it. You're going to use, this is the book you're going to want to quote: Small But Important Riots, the Cavalry Battles of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. And it's a nice book. It is hardcover. There's some nice maps, a lot of photos. Hell, University, one of the imprints of University of Nebraska Press. So for people who really like their university press books, this is one of them. So it's definitely one you're going to want to get. Two more questions, and then I'll let you go here. Promotions. So we talked about two of the big three. You alluded to Farnsworth a little bit in terms of not being as visible. Again, I'll ask because it's a topic you've done work on. Is Pleasanton currying favor with Uncle John in the Farnsworth promotion, or is that too broad of a stroke?
No, that question can't be ignored. Now, the idea has always been, part of the old story was that he writes the letters to Uncle John Farnsworth. He has Elon write a letter to Uncle John Farnsworth at the same time. And then the idea is that they get to Farnsworth and Farnsworth gets them promoted. And I don't believe any of that last part of that. I don't think they ever leave Pleasanton's desk, because he finds out he's been promoted shortly thereafter. He's actually promoted on June 22nd himself. He doesn't know that yet when he writes the letters. He will find that out probably the same day. So I don't think he ever sends the letters. As I've looked, if Farnsworth had gone the political route, and I mean Uncle John, the congressman, there'd be some evidence in the Stanton papers or War Department files. There's nothing to say that he ever interceded on their behalf. I don't think that happens. But that's not to say that Pleasanton wasn't trying to make it happen. I just think the scenario changes almost immediately to negate the need for it, at least in part. And then when you look at the actual promotion process they go through, it happens in one day. Pleasanton writes the letter after Meade has learned he's commanding the army.
Right.
He writes the letter. And, I can try to put my spin on one more myth without taking up too much more time. We had this idea that Meade, and this is in the ORs, and Meade asked Pleasanton somehow, and I'll paraphrase it, you may know better than I do. He tells Pleasanton, I want you to stay with me, by my side going forward. And so everyone says, well, Pleasanton's an idiot. He doesn't, so Meade doesn't trust him.
Right.
Well, if he doesn't trust him, why would he, on the very first day he's promoted, promote three guys for this guy?
That he just basically recommended. Yeah.
He gets this, He's all of his capital. He gets in Hardee's order. He gets the authority to fire and hire anybody he wants. I don't know that any other general before him getting command of the army is getting that in writing. So he doesn't like Pleasanton. Why would he use up this capital? What he does is the opposite. He gets a letter. He dashes off 3 very fast notes. They're telegraphed to Washington. The word comes back. It all happens as fast. If the politicians had been involved in that, we'd still be trying to get it done. All right. They just it wouldn't have happened that fast. So I don't think there's any political part of it. It's a military thing. They want to keep Meade happy in this situation. It works to the cavalry's advantage. And in terms of the relationship between the two men, and I need to take us a little bit farther. We ignore the idea that they were very good friends, Meade and Pleasanton. Meade's men, his infantrymen, those whose writings I've seen, they just got a thrill out of watching the cavalry combat on June 22nd. Most of them had never seen anything like this. They wrote about it. Vincent wrote about it. It was a thrill for them. I think Meade appreciated it. Their headquarters were very close together for several days in Aldie. I'm certain they probably, I don't know this, but they probably spent some time together. What I do know is that later on, I think it's in August, Lewis Henry Carpenter, a captain with the 6th U.S. Cavalry, his company is now part of Meade's headquarters escort. And he writes a letter saying that they are the best of friends, that they spend every night together having dinner, very close. So this idea that he didn't trust him, that Meade didn't trust Pleasanton, is, I think, completely wrong. Having said that, when Pleasanton testifies at the Committee of the Conduct of the War in March, and he goes against Meade, there's no forgiving that. That is what Meade calls the blackest ingratitude, and there's no way to forgive that. There's no explaining it, except that is where I think the idea of Pleasanton as having this overriding ambition comes in. He thinks he's got a chance to command the Army of the Potomac, and he doesn't want to let anything stand in his way. I don't defend him.
And it's hard to overlook that one. So, yeah. All right. Well, any closing thoughts?
I've enjoyed the heck out of it. We could do this,
I know, yeah.
If you felt like doing it for another hour, we'd probably do it but I don't think anybody would watch. So
well, yeah, no,
they get together more often and have a beer. That's what we need.
Yeah, well, exactly. People probably don't realize we have our own little Bighorn roundtable where, like, Knights of the Round Table, us and some locals get together and discuss little Bighorn matters. For anybody who's remotely interested in that topic, Bob has also written for publication on the Battle of the Rosebud, June 17th, 1876, kind of typically referred to as a prelude to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Blue and Gray, was that Blue and Gray? I'm drawing a blank right now. Yes.
Blue and Gray, 2017, I think.
Yeah, Blue and Gray, one of their Little Bighorn. Was it one of the Little Bighorn related? I've got it.
2 issues where they stepped away from the Civil War completely. Dave really loved that area out there and the idea of it, and did the Little Bighorn article and then mine.
Yeah, kind of like Bob's first book. Those issues are kind of collector's items now, if you can find one. But Bob, I think one of the things we're doing on the podcast. I'm giving my Washington D.C. tour this coming weekend, but we did Brandy Station with Chris a month ago, and we're going to do Appomattox later this fall. No offense, folks, but Gettysburg at times is kind of becoming kind of a hassle to do these group tours at. Do you think you would want to do a listener tour? Maybe we set something up in 2024, or
I'll do whatever you want to.
All right,
all right. In the past doing it, and whenever you want it, we'll do it.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that offline and try to get something put together. Well, folks, this is the one you want to get. I'm going to hold it up one more time. Bob, of course, has the kind of the poster behind him, but Small But Important Riots, the Cavalry Battles of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. my friend and esteemed cavalry historian, Bob O'Neill. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I'm with you. We could easily go for a few more hours here, but we got to leave something for the people to read about, right? We can't give away all the goods right now, but thanks for taking an evening to sit here and talk with me. I appreciate it, and I owe you one.
I appreciate you inviting me on, Jim. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Fun.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And thanks everybody who's been tuning into these YouTube videos, Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. We'll continue to do more of these, at least until I run out of friends to talk to. So thanks everybody. And Bob, thanks again. We'll talk to y'all later.
Okay.